You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 384 of the podcast. And this one, I got back on Dr. Steven Phillipson. Steven is a licensed clinical psychologist who specialises in CBT for OCD. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, then you will have heard Steven on the show many times before. This episode is a topic that's a bit more philosophical. We're talking about 4 different themes and then how they relate to OCD. And these themes are living within the variability of being human, being centered, autonomy, and assertiveness. Now, I enjoyed this conversation with Steve. These are all ideas worth considering and thinking about. Take what works for you and leave what doesn't. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. This podcast episode is available as a video recording on our Patreon. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. Thank you to you guys, as always, for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Steve for his time. And without further ado, here he is. Welcome back to the show, Steve.
Stu, always a pleasure. One of the highlights of my career is being able to speak to you. You're absolutely my favorite interviewer. You just have a nature that brings out the best in me.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to have you here. So we're going to talk about a few concepts today. So living within the variability of being human, being centered, the autonomy, or what autonomy is, and why it's important, and then assertiveness. And obviously where we can, linking that to OCD and OCD treatment. So initially, living within the variability of being human, where do you want to start with that?
So I think that it's very easy to, I hope it's easy for most people to acknowledge that they're human. The problem isn't acknowledging that we're human. The problem is, how do we define what it means to be human? What are the characteristics and qualities that every human has in common? And it's within this definition that you can really gain a great deal of kind of emotional peace, because unfortunately, most people place qualitative labels on humans. And particularly themselves, as in good person, bad person, loser, inadequate, deficient, unworthy. And so that's really one of the first and most pervasive mental crimes that humans and the human mind creates and is kind of guilty of. The idea of taking a human and aggregating the qualities of a human into a singular qualitative definition. Aggregate means to take a number of different variables, to cluster them all together, and then to derive a singular understanding or definition of those qualities. So, I can say that I am a decent tennis player, I'm an excellent sailor, and in treating OCD, I think I'm above average. I am horrible at basketball. I spell on a 3rd grade level. And when I'm on a sailboat and I'm racing, I can have a pretty unpleasant management of anger. I can sometimes get frustrated and speak in a very aggressive way, unfortunately. And so you take all of these qualities, and there are a few more that make up my life, and you put them together, and some people might say Steve's an angry guy, or some people might say, Steve is brilliant. But I refuse to accept any label for me as a human other than human. And although, people might have that inclination, I think it's really important that we reject any qualitative label. Obviously, quantitative is to say, my bowling score averages a 170. I play tennis at a level 3.5. So we can quantitatively evaluate certain aspects of our functioning in each particular area. But a qualitative conclusion means that we put a judgment on a definition. So good person is qualitative. A better bowler than average is quantitative. So the difficult part in defining human and in trying to come up with a consensus of, what do we all share? What can we say are kind of universal qualities within being human? And here's where things are going to begin to get difficult and are very difficult to transition toward this belief system, and even much more difficult to live within the belief system. So number one, Stu, can we agree, and it's okay if you don't, can we agree, Stu, that all humans have some element of mental health challenges?
Oh yeah, I fully agree with that statement.
Uh-huh.
I believe most people could benefit from therapy. We all have some stuff holding us back. It doesn't have to be a
go
DSM
beyond
label.
both. I would say I would go with the vast majority.
Well, yeah, I just don't want to be too. I agree. Yeah, 99.999%.
Yeah, so we can agree that all humans have a variety, not just one, but a variety of mental health challenges.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's funny because when my OCD patients say, if I didn't have OCD, my life would be great. And I would say to them, if OCD is your only problem, then you would be the most healthy person that I've ever met in my life. Okay, so if we can agree that that's number one. Can we agree, Stu, that all humans have moments of weakness?
Absolutely.
So there are moments where, despite us living with our values, our moral agendas, our principles, that through the day, all humans occasionally violate our values and don't uphold our highest aspirations. We agree to that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Can we agree that all humans have the capacity to make disciplined choices and to show qualities such as compassion, forgiveness, and empathy?
Yeah.
So the problem is that humans predominantly believe that we exist in ways where we can make comparisons. So, am I a more loving person than you? Or am I more of a loser than you? Am I more interpersonally deficient than you? Unfortunately, I would have to say yes. I think you've got great social skills, and you probably have better social skills than me, but that exists only in that one variable of social effectiveness or interpersonal effectiveness compared to, let's say, being a good person or not a good person. Most people would say that you're a better person than I am. And in that regard, I would say, well, I disagree because, we can't follow Steve or Stu around, for our entire lives. And so therefore, to equal better or worse, I think is sort of an impossible goal to achieve. Would you agree with that, Stu?
Yeah, I agree. I think on the interpersonal stuff, when I've got a mic, I'm good. You take the mic away, I lose a lot of my skills and ability.
Well, I've seen you beyond having a mic. Obviously, we've met in person, and I have to say that your interpersonal skills, in my humble opinion, are excellent across the board. But obviously, I'm not your wife, and she may have
a different opinion. Yeah.
So, one of the important things is living with the idea of the absurdity of trying to make, comparatives. So, if someone says, Steve, you're a loser, I might say, well, I'm aware that I have social skill deficiencies, being dyslexic. People who are dyslexic and learning disabled in that way, they tend to have certain interpersonal skill deficiencies. Some people might say on the spectrum that I haven't owned yet, but that's a possibility. Um, but the point is that, I don't allow for any qualitative conclusion from my own brain or for others other than human. So if someone says that, oh, you're a good person, Steve, I would say, well, you don't really know me that well. So in my mind, I would just translate that going back to human. And when we really embrace uh, our definition as human, and we don't allow for any conclusions or qualitative descriptors that have an aggregate to them beyond human, there's a tremendous amount of peacefulness that comes from that. So when I was growing up, I had a goal of being a good person. And I tried really hard, but my humanness always got in the way. And no matter how hard I tried to be a good person, the gravity of my humanness would always win out. And so I grew up until I was 26 believing that I was a bad person because I believed in, the idea that humans can be aggregate and defined qualitatively through the aggregate. And I think that's really tragic that most people live also within that aggregate. And the problem is, as I mentioned, not only in my choice article, but I think in prior podcasts, that the human brain tends to place a lot more weight on our deficiencies than our assets. So if we live in the belief of humans being able to be judged qualitatively, then the human brain will much more focus on our deficiencies. And I even believe someone like, let's say, Donald Trump, who is the world-renowned, some people might say narcissist. I won't say that because I don't want him to sue me. I have never met him, so I can't give him a diagnosis. But some people might say he's the world-renowned narcissist. Him and Putin. And I would say, that even they probably more silently suffer within their humanness than the public persona that they project. So if someone says, oh, I don't like Steve, I don't think Steve is a good person. Once again, the way that I translate that, rather than being like, oh, they've discovered that I'm a bad person, is to say they're noticing qualities within me that they're disagreeing with, disapproving of, or having a negative reaction to. And the same thing to say Steve's a good person or anyone's a good person is that the qualities that we're noticing, we're placing a biased weight on the positive, or we've only been exposed to the majority of the positive, and therefore reaching some type of a primitive conclusion about good or bad person, or, a winner or a loser, that these are, very, very primitive, kind of mental crimes. So I think that one of the important ways in facilitating the peace that comes from acceptance within being human is basically, and there are quite a number, but one of them is basically being authentic. If you're being authentic, if you're being real, and if someone dislikes you, then okay, they've seen qualities that you believe to be an accurate representation of your style and ideas and performance, and they've decided that they don't like those qualities. But that dislike is now at least an honest and sincere reaction to the qualities that you've decided to share with those around you. It's always painful when I hear about people who try really hard to be liked or try hard to be approved of. And I'm sure, we've all met people who were just like, we never see a single, kind of like you, Stu, although I'm not saying you try in any way, you just have a natural proclivity. But, there are certain people that seem to just always come across in a very positive, likable way. And on one hand, you can say that's a great social skill. But on the other hand, the question is, are they being authentic, or are they working hard to being approved of? Because, when we're not living within the idea of the acceptance of our humanity, we can become very vulnerable to the judgment of others. And so, it's in the loss of that autonomy where we fear being judged by others or are concerned about being judged by others, that we put an effort into, being light rather than being real.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, if I take myself as a case study, I think I'm pretty congruent with who I am on the podcast, and that's been reflected by others I've met. And they said, "Oh, you're one." I remember one person, I won't name them, but they said they've hung out with me a couple of times, and they said when people ask her what I'm like, she just says he's exactly the same as on the podcast, but his humor's a lot dirtier. And that's I'm not going to share weird jokes. I'm not going to swear a lot on the podcast because I don't want to offend people. I'm not going to talk about politics or religion or anything like that because I try and be of the way I am in therapy, which is neutral, to a point, and letting whoever's in the room or listening, it's about them, not me. So I try and put some of my personality down and be a bit more professional, so to speak. But the core of me comes across, I think, the same. But there's the nuances that some people may not like that I don't.
Sure.
But some people may love it, So it's, yeah. But the other thing you said actually there about being good, some people might say, "Oh, Steve's good," and some people might say Steve's bad. And you said how they're just noticing maybe some of the naughtier qualities in you versus the good qualities. I don't want to say bad, That's true, but I think also they might be projecting. It might have nothing to do with you, that they're projecting their own stuff onto you, and you're just a canvas for their internal world. Quite psychodynamic, but I think that comes into play sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think that that was a brilliant point. That being disapproved of, I couldn't agree with you more, is a reflection on the filters of the observer. Much more than, let's say, the qualities of the person being judged, and owning that perspective, Stu, is one of the key ingredients in, the acceptance and peace of being human, and the acceptance and peace of living within a centered life process, and really living within an autonomous life process. So I really appreciate that you brought that to my attention. These principles are really tough pills for people to swallow, and I'm going to go over some reasons why. It's so easy, and it's so I think it's so rewarding to say that someone like Mother Teresa is a good person. You're familiar with that name?
Yeah,
because she died probably around when you were very small. And I was using Mother Teresa as an example of, the societal definition of a good person. And one of my patients said, "Oh my God, I hate her. She's terrible." And I'd never heard that before. I was like, "Where do you get that from?" And my patient said, "She is totally opposed in India, where, the birth rate is horrendous, and they need education about birth control. And Mother Teresa is very opposed to birth control because she's living within her Catholic doctrine." And my patient thought that her, rhetoric about the sinfulness of birth control, made her a horrible person. So great example of how impossible it is for us to, come to these easy qualitative conclusions. One of the most famous presidents from this country's history, Thomas Jefferson. Does that name ring a bell to you?
It does, yeah.
Okay, because he wrote the naughty letter to King George saying that we're breaking away from England, the Declaration of Independence. Okay. And then he became our third president, and he's an incredibly liked president. His picture is on some of our currency. But as much as Thomas Jefferson might be thought of as a good person, he definitely fathered children from his slaves. And there are many people who don't think that was a good idea on his part. And then, speaking of complex, I think one of your country's greatest heroes, at least in modern times, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
And I definitely appreciate him in what he did for your country during, as he said, England's darkest hour, and it certainly was in the late 30s and early 40s. And your hero Winston Churchill, who was also, I think he was in World War One. Apparently he had a problem with alcohol, and apparently he had a problem with the definition of monogamy. Apparently his reputation is that he really liked chasing women around. And same thing with Gandhi. Even though Gandhi was responsible for liberating India, he also had a real difficulties with the concept of fidelity. On the other hand, someone like Adolf Hitler. When I say, what's a bad person? Everyone says Adolf Hitler, right? Now everyone says Trump and Adolf Hitler. But, once again, it's so easy and it's so societally expected that we reach these conclusions. The Adolf Hitler, I saw videos of him. He really loved his dog. And apparently he treated Eva Braun, his mistress, very well. And she loved him so much, she decided to kill herself with him at the end. So the rhetoric goes. The problem with owning the idea of, societal standards of good and bad people is that our brains will turn that judgment gavel on ourselves. So if Adolf Hitler is a bad person, the brain will, as we said, it will find these negative qualities in us, and it will make sort of similar conclusions. We might not say I'm as bad as Adolf Hitler, but if we believe in the concept of labeling people as good or bad, then the natural consequence of that is our own brain will find these qualities because it places this negative bias on our deficiencies, and it will reach these conclusions predominantly about ourselves. Another very difficult concept is the idea of emotional responsibility. This falls now a little bit into the world of centeredness. If a man cheats on his wife, she might say, "Oh, my husband hurt me," but in the world of emotional centeredness, we would say that her pain is a derivative of the investment and trust that she made in the relationship. We would say, yes, her husband betrayed that trust, but the pain that comes from that betrayal is because of the investment that she made. There's just as much likelihood, perhaps, that she'd been looking for a good reason to leave the marriage and was having a difficult time. Let's say she didn't want to disrupt the children's lives. And so the same act where the husband cheats on her, she may now experience a sense of relief and even joy. Oh, I'm so glad I caught you being unfaithful, because now I've got this great reason to end the marriage, and I don't need to battle my own sense of responsibility for, the impact on the children. So, the idea of saying like, "Oh, you hurt me" when you said that insult to me, becomes, I'm reacting with my own hurt because of my own vulnerability and susceptibility to being judged by others. So any questions, comments on that topic?
Yeah. I guess in terms of human variability, and we'll go on to human centeredness, human centeredness in a second, but human variability, if we just link it to OCD for a second, is that
Sure?
Yeah. Why is that important within OCD treatment, do you think, understanding this and working towards it maybe? Or
I treat many conditions, even though I'm only typecast for OCD. I have a joke that I tell patients. A patient might say to me, "My mom died last night. Is it okay if I mention that?" As if anything other than OCD, I don't talk about it.
Yeah.
But within OCD, I would say that's the one condition where people believe the most in the degree to which they're sort of impaired. Many people with OCD live with the idea that anyone on this planet who doesn't have OCD are the luckiest bastards alive. And because they have OCD, they have an affliction that basically defines the ruin of their life. And, I think that's such a tragic perspective for people who suffer from OCD, to think that, oh, because I have this, my life is ruined. My life is much more burdened than the average person. I wonder, Stu, in your practice, whether you found that to be the case also.
Can be, yeah. I work primarily with children and young people, so maybe it's a little different to adults that are coming to see you. But yeah, in the older teens, it can definitely come up. Yeah.
So in that regard, I think, and you used the very, pivotal word when you said human variability. And I use that phrase quite a bit, especially if I've done something that someone else doesn't like. I'll just be like, not to totally be dismissive, but I might say, hey, variability, meaning as a human being, I'm going to have moments of weakness and moments of strength. And, none of us sort of escapes that gravity. But I do think that it's really important for people with OCD to recognize that, they have a condition which is and can be very disruptive and extremely uncomfortable, but that they basically suffer as all others suffer. And it reminds me, going back to our good friend Buddha, who said 5,000 years ago, living is suffering. And, Buddha obviously is a pretty well-known name, pretty wise guy. And for him to say that life is suffering for all humans, I think he had a really important insight and a really important perspective, because he then goes on to say that when we all acknowledge and appreciate that life is suffering for all of us, that we experience less pain from that suffering, that we don't toil about the suffering because, we don't give ourselves a headache for having a headache. We just accept that this is part of the human condition.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
So the next concept I want to talk about is I say, it takes an hour to understand and it takes a lifetime to master. And that's the concept of being centered. Being centered is not like a trophy that we can achieve and then carry with us. Well, look, I've got the centered trophy. Being centered is a moment-to-moment struggle, within the tug of war of our humanness, to really access the skills and perspective of being centered. Being centered is the awareness of, or as I say, it's being complete with our incompleteness. It's accepting, that as humans, as we've said, we all have challenges, we all have defects, and it's being at peace with that unavoidable existence of that variability. Being centered is a place that's sort of impervious to being judged by others or being controlled or manipulated by others. In a centered perspective, we can hear feedback from others, and we can take it in, and we can gauge it against our own perspective, our own values. Being centered does not seek any external validation or affirmation. So it would be nice if someone said, "Oh, Steve, you're the most brilliant OCD therapist in history." That would be very nice to hear, but that doesn't define who I am, what I am, or what my beliefs are. That's just an opinion or a representation of someone else's view. In living life, in choosing a centered perspective, there's a tremendous amount of sort of both peace, but also power. Because within being centered, we have the power and willingness to express ourselves in a very authentic way, because it's not vulnerable to being judged negatively for our perspective. And in living a centered perspective, it doesn't mean that we're closed off to the influence of others' opinions. It means that we pick and choose whose opinions we're going to give relevance to. An example that I had many, many years ago, I think in 1988, I changed my hairstyle to this current one, which is a 1980s hairstyle, and it hasn't changed since. But when I changed my hair to this style, I asked the administrator of the place that I worked at, who I thought was a very professional woman and a very honest person. And I thought that, she would tell me whether the appearance that it gave suggested some like new wave freak or still, a new wave influence, but still conveyed a professional perspective. And so she's the only person after I got this hairstyle who I asked her opinion, and she said, yeah, it looks good, and you do look professional. So based on her singular opinion, I was open to that feedback, and that was the only person I asked, because that was the only person whose opinion I was interested in. So anyone else who makes fun of me, and I like being made fun of, by the way, for my 1980s haircut, and other ways in which I communicate or dress in ways that are not of this time. I find it just very amusing, because, I don't mind people noticing qualities within me that are, I call unique. They might call mistimed or culturally inappropriate. But once again, it's my understanding that, is the perspective of relevance to me, as I pick and choose whose opinion I would give relevance to. So in living in a centered perspective, there are ways in which we can enhance or even, build a centered process. One very, very powerful way is self-disclosure of our humannesses. So many people, think that it's important to not let others see how defective we are, because we might be judged. But in living in a centered process where being judged we're immune to being judged, we can bolster our sense of peace with our variability by being open and disclosing about it. So I remember in my early days of dating, I thought the goal of dating was to show a woman I had a good sense of humor, and to show a woman that I was intelligent. And so I tried really hard to be funny, and I tried really hard to be intelligent. And the results of that were not promising, because I think women have got really great instincts in seeing men who are trying to be approved of, and it becomes very unattractive. But when I started practicing the principles of centeredness, I completely gave up trying to win someone over. And I went to the perspective of just looking for someone who I wanted to spend time with. And that's the very, very important shift in living through the principles of being centered. Is we don't seek approval. We seek we seek entertainment. We seek fulfillment. And so in looking for that fulfillment, we become the investigator of the person that we're with, rather than being fearful of being investigated. And I used to share early on in dating, very personal things, like being left back in third grade because I'm dyslexic, and lying about why I was so old in these classrooms that everyone else was a year younger than me, because I couldn't face the shame. And lying about not having a father, because I was the only person I knew who didn't have a father. So I would share these pieces of my history, with women, not with the idea of, and I hope that you approve of me anyway, but with the idea that I'm going to really look carefully at how you manage this information. Because if you don't respond in an empathic way that conveys sort of the recognition that was a painful period of my life, then I'm not going to spend any more time with you, because you're not reacting in a way for someone that I'd want to spend time with and someone that I'd want to make an investment in. And so that's a huge part of centeredness, is the ability to live within our own authenticity. And also, I find self-deprecating humor to be an incredibly powerful tool in the facilitation of centeredness, being able to make fun of ourselves, and really actually enjoying being made fun of is a really, really important part of that. In college, the dorm that I lived in had a reputation where everyone was, let's say, a wise guy. Everyone's form of entertainment in my dorm was to abuse everyone else in the dorm with the greatest degree of skill and humor. And it wasn't meant in terms of being demeaning. It was just meant like who could be the funniest. And so, my nickname in college in my dorm was Nose, because I used to charge people to drive them home from Virginia to New Jersey, which was a 7-hour car trip. I used to charge them $10, and the other persons on my hall thought that was exorbitant. And so they called me Nose as an anti-Semitic comment, because Jews have big noses. And so nose was just an anti-Semitic reference to my anatomical Jewish nose. I thought it was hysterical. And even one of my girlfriends knit me a nose sock for the winter as a way of just having a good time with it. But, being able to laugh at ourselves and being able to even make fun of ourselves is a tremendous way of conveying the peacefulness of being human and the peacefulness of that acceptance that all of us humans, can be very comedic in our defectiveness, is that our defective qualities can be actually very, very amusing, and not really something that we need to be vulnerable about in terms of being judged.
I think what comes up for me there is we've talked a lot in the past about the use of humor in treatment for OCD. And the college stories you were sharing there kind of reminds me of that, of, I don't know, just in treatment, trying to make light of things. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, it just occurred to me, you saying that, I think people with body dysmorphic disorder, which I think of all of the different expressions of OCD, and we did a podcast on, all spikes are created equal. But unfortunately, all spike treatments are not created equal. And body dysmorphic disorder happens to be one of the most treatment-resistant subsets of OCD. And it just occurred to me that it might be an extremely powerful tool for people with body dysmorphic disorder to actually kind of point out and make light of what they perceive to be their defect, because it's such a contradiction. Their brain is saying, you need to hide this, you need to put makeup on this, you need to, kind of cover it in some way. And for someone to be able to literally point it out and make fun of their own, perceived defect as a way of showing their brain that they're overriding the instinct for shame and choosing, more of a centered acceptance, which is a huge part of the recovery process that you're aware.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think that can go for, all forms of OCD, to say, I'm going to go wash my hands after I touch that subway rail because, God knows you can catch AIDS from a subway pole. So, I'm going to go rid myself of AIDS. That can be, I think, a very powerful way of diffusing some of the shame and pain that can go along with many a spike theme. So in a centered perspective, one thing that comes up is this idea about, well, what does it mean if my partner is unfaithful? What does it mean if my partner has a sexual relationship with another person? It's such a crime that people think, oh, how did I fail the relationship? That this person cheated on me. What does it say about me being inadequate as a partner? But in a centered perspective, if one's partner is sexually unfaithful, the centered person would say that that person made that choice, that that person's relationship with their values of honesty or their values of monogamy, have betrayed the contract of the relationship. And so, once again, these are not easy principles to live by. It's so ingrained tragically in society that, obviously there are such things as good or bad people, or if someone cheats on me, that says that I wasn't adequate. And so the discipline of living within being centered, I can tell you, is extremely difficult. The gravity of our society is regularly pulling us away from living within a centered life process. And even our own brain voice, as I mentioned in many, many episodes ago, our own brain voice is the number one culprit in speaking to us in a way that is disavowing the discipline of being centered. And so for us as the gatekeeper to choose these centered processes, is very, very difficult. I always refer to it as like a tug of war, in which it's so important that the gatekeeper has the final voice. Really quickly, moving on to autonomy, which I think is very, very it's very, very parallel to the principles of being centered. In autonomy, there is a peacefulness that comes from the acceptance, once again, of our variability as humans. In autonomy, we are emotionally independent. We don't need to seek approval from others, because we have faith that our own perspectives, our own worldviews, are owned by us, and therefore that gives them substance and weight. And that's not to say that we're impervious to the opinions of others. When I share an opinion with a friend or a patient, I will often qualify it with, I have an inkling of faith in this idea, or this is just an idea that I'm just formulating. And so don't take this as a strong perspective. It's just kind of a glimmer of an idea, all the way up to, I'm as confident about this idea as I am confident that I'm holding a pen. And that doesn't mean that this is true or this is reality, but it means that I have a tremendous amount of faith behind that perspective. So, living with an autonomy, it doesn't dismiss being approved of. People say, when they hear these principles, they say, I want to live in a life where I don't care about the opinions of others. And I immediately offer a different perspective. I say, I care deeply about the opinions of others. It's just that those opinions don't define me. They offer me a perspective, an idea that I can then process through my own understandings and then come up with my own response and my own perspective. So, I definitely appreciate that you invite me back on the show. It actually means the world to me. But it doesn't define me as a successful person. It just, to me, suggests that we have really good chemistry, and that to this point, the majority of the ideas that I share, you believe to be valuable for your listeners. And so what we're talking about is perspective, and then the strength of our perspective, rather than, reaching conclusions. And so within autonomy, we don't live within a world of right and wrong. We live more within a world of degree of commitment or ownership of our own views.
Yeah, good point. And I think to not care about what anyone thinks, the word, it just reminded me of narcissism. That's what came to my head, because it's not my area of expertise, so I could be wrong here, but part of being narcissistic or a narcissist would be to not care what anyone thinks of you.
So it's interesting, Stu, because narcissism exists on two levels. The narcissist is very invested in projecting an image of superiority. And the narcissist often fails miserably in the department of what's called empathy or perspective taking. The narcissist is so wrapped around protecting their own image that they fail to engage in the perspective taking of, gee, what's going on in your world? Because they're so heavily engaged in, is my world showing the superiority? Is my world conveying my specialness, my uniqueness, my greatness, right? And so the narcissist wants to project a sense of superiority, but the tragedy is that it's a very thin cover for their actual sense of inadequacy and almost non-existence. And so the narcissist has to perform to maintain an image. They have to kind of advertise their uniqueness, their specialness, their superiority, because they actually feel so inadequate. You and I earlier today were talking about my favorite troll, the person who made some accusations when you were on my yacht a few years ago, that you and I, even though we had guests on the boat, behaved in an
sexual manner.
What's that?
A sexual manner. Just throw it out there.
Behaved in a sexual manner. And when it came to my attention that this person, my favorite troll, had made these suggestions, I found it very funny because, it's such a kind of a pathetic effort at getting attention. And, in a way, there's a great saying by Oscar Wilde, a wonderful British poet and author. And Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And so that I had made this troll's radar. I was like, oh, this is so great. This is wonderful. But actually, most likely, as we concurred, this person is living through their own sense of inadequacy and their own sense of emotional pain, because people who make a hobby of trying to disrupt others who are in the public light are, really just compensating for their own pain and doing it in kind of a pathetic way. Really quickly, I want to just go over one of the most important means of maintaining autonomy and centeredness, and that is assertiveness. So people always say to me when I talk about assertiveness, oh, I hate confrontations. And assertiveness has nothing to do with being confrontational. A confrontation is where you're trying to be right and you're trying to get the other person to be wrong. Confrontation often has an element of anger to it. In assertiveness, it's nothing more than educating a person about one's own values, priorities, and perspective, and sometimes the feelings that go with it. So I have a really good friend whose wife is always between 10 and 20 minutes late. And I am what people might call a time Nazi. I definitely value punctuality, and if people are late, I might make mention that it's a preference of mine that they be on time. And so this past weekend, I got together with my good friend, and they were right on time. And I was like, oh, I'm so happy to see you guys on time. That is actually a form of assertiveness. It's just expressing of the feelings happy and the variable associated with it, which is punctuality. Assertiveness doesn't blame. So if you were my wife and I said, you don't hold my hand nearly as much as you used to. Now, you might, hear that as me requesting for you to hold my hand more often or be more affectionate, but there's an accusation involved in that. And so in assertiveness, I would say, it really means a lot to me when you reach out and are affectionate. And if it's okay with you, if you could try to be more aware of it, it would really mean a lot to me if in the future, you were mindful to being affectionate, because I find it so rewarding. So in that regard, there is still the expression of a preference without there being an accusation of, that you're committing the crime of being cold and distant.
Yeah. Good point.
So when we assert ourselves, we're showing us that we exist and that our preferences and perspective has merit and value. And going back to the building of being centered and the tools that facilitate being centered, assertiveness is a huge component of that. Assertiveness, by the way, doesn't say, you made me mad when you were late. It would say, I reacted with frustration, at your lateness. And so once again, going back to the idea that we're responsible for our own feelings, in assertiveness, it communicates through that responsibility.
Yeah. Or it made me feel undervalued when you were late, or when you're continuously late. It makes me feel like I'm not significant enough, or whatever it is.
Exactly.
The feeling. Yeah.
Exactly. As opposed to saying, when you're constantly late, I'm wondering whether or not you have empathy to how that impacts my life.
Yeah, which is gonna get an egos kick in, and then there's an argument.
Well, let's hope not. Being centered does not have an ego, by the way.
No, I mean, if you do the opposite way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, look, I have a million more questions. However, we have run out of time. Hopefully people have found this more philosophical episode useful to life and their recovery. And appreciate your time as always.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Always enjoy the conversations and wish you a happy day today.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theOCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.